One popular technique when it comes to foundation piecing is using freezer paper. This tutorial will walk you through the entire process of freezer paper foundation piecing. I'm going to show you how to use freezer paper sheets or freezer paper on the roll to foundation piece a block. Many people swear by it, so I'm going to walk you through the steps and then you can decide whether or not this is for you. First of all, freezer paper can be purchased in the grocery store on the roll. It's just a big roll of paper that you will cut to paper size, 8.5 by 11. So if you buy it in the grocery store, that's what you're going to want to do, is cut pieces out, because you will need to fuse that paper to a piece of cardstock in order to send it through your printer. Freezer paper is also available already pre-cut in 8.5 by 11-inch sheets, all ready to go through your printer. If you look at freezer paper, it has a glossy side and then it has a matte or a dull side, more of a paper side. You will print your foundation pattern on this side, the matte side. You will not print on the glossy side. So there are ways that you can print this easily, or you can do what I did, and I did it wrong every single time until I finally came up with the right way to do it that worked with my printer. If you have an inkjet printer, from what I understand, I don't, I have a laser printer. But if you have an inkjet printer, from what I understand, you can just send the paper through the printer and there's no heat involved, so it will just print. My concern is that this side tends to have a little bit of a grip to it. And I would be afraid if I sent it with nothing behind it that it would get stuck. So I'm not sure I would do that. I think before I would send it through an inkjet printer, I would follow the same steps that I'm going to show you with my laser printer. So this is the paper. There are several brands of freezer paper. This is the one that I've used and works fine. Okay, here's all the mistakes that I made, and I'm going to show them to you just so that you don't do the same thing. The first time I sent this through my printer, I sent it through, this is the glossy side, and I didn't realize that the heat was going to make such a big deal, and it rolled up on my roller. So this was a mess. I got it out, but it was not fun, and it could have really damaged my printer. So I thought, uh-oh, that's not going to work. What I need to do is put a paper behind this. So I got a piece of paper, actually just a regular piece of paper. I put it behind the freezer paper. Now this is before it was printed. And I took my iron and I pressed the top. I pressed it on there. I pressed the whole thing. Well, my iron was too hot. So what happened was, when I took it off, it just tore it to pieces and all of the glossy is gone. So that was not a smart move. You can see that where it was printed on here, it was very difficult to remove because I fused it to the paper. So don't do that. The next thing I did, I thought, okay, I need to send it through with a piece of paper under it and not iron it down. Okay, so I put it in, I actually put it the manual feed, and what happened was it pulled through the bottom piece and the top piece actually didn't stay lined up. So it could have done the same damage that it did with the previous one because they didn't stick together. And I was trying to shove it through to get it going, and it did make it through and I can use it, but not a good way to do it. So then I decided that I was going to use my glue stick, and I just put some glue right across the top. I used regular paper behind it so it was glued down. I sent this through, but look, it's still kind of scary because you can see that it's bent, it's bubbled a little bit. It got off track when it was going through, and it was not, I didn't think, a secure way to send it through. Plus, my foundation pattern is kind of wrinkled, so I didn't want that either. So my final try after all that was I took a piece of cardstock paper. You know cardstock, it's just a little bit thicker than regular paper. I glued that to the top. I just took and ran my glue stick right across the top, and the freezer paper was on top, sent it through my printer, and it worked like a charm. So this was the way to do it after all that testing. I made sure that it stayed nice and flat. It went through. The negative side to this, when I use regular paper, I can feed through, 80 blocks. The freezer paper will last for maybe 3 or 4 blocks, maybe 5, and then it gets too linty on the back from the fabric. So you really don't need as many foundation patterns when it comes to this. You can easily reuse the pattern several times, the foundation pattern, and then use a new one. So now that I have actually been able to print this foundation pattern on my freezer paper, this is the matte side, the paper side, and it's all lined up. I need to prepare this before I can add my pieces. From what many people do, they just use the folding method where they fold using the ruler and fold on the line. I found that using the tracing wheel was really helpful. When I used this, it was easy for me to fold, but it didn't damage the paper, and I'm still only able to use it 4 or 5 times, so that's not an issue. But I would not use the perforating blade because you don't need to remove the paper. The whole purpose of foundation piecing with freezer paper is that the piece of paper stays intact because you don't sew on it. You sew next to the lines rather than on the lines. So this is where I would take my ruler, place it right on that line, and I would use the tracing wheel on all of those lines all the way around to give me that accurate fold that I just don't seem to get that with the ruler, especially because this paper is a little thicker and it's harder to fold back. So you want to give it a nice push, put some pressure on that, and then look, it does fold nicely right on that line. Easily. Okay, now we are going to add our fabric pieces, and remember, we don't sew on this paper, we sew next to the lines, so there's going to be no damage to this paper other than the little bit of lint from the fabric that's going to get onto the glossy side. So the first thing we're going to do is take our 5" by 5" square, wrong side up, and we are going to place it underneath. Now I'm not going to use the light board here because I can see there's pieces, the way it's coming out, I can match up those perforation lines, and it gives me a pretty good view of what I have. This is where we're going to use our iron, maybe 5 or 6 seconds. And we're going to fuse that piece right to it. Look at that, that's not going to move. That is really fused nicely, but it will come off easily without any damage to your fabric. So that part is really good. Now we are going to do that trimming. We need to trim. So we're going to pull this back carefully, and that perforation is there. See how easily that folds back? That's so nice. And we are going to trim our 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to use my add 1/4 for this one. So it's pushed right up against the fold. And there I've trimmed it nicely. Okay, here's the key part. I'm going to take my next piece, which is my green one. That's going to go on piece A2. And I am going to mark those midpoints, lining up my ruler and drawing the midpoints on each edge. It's a little harder with the freezer paper because it doesn't want to let you write on that glossy side, but you can get it to work. It's enough that you can see it. Do that part again. Press a little bit on the pencil, and there you go. So we've got that marked. Now for piece A2, we're gonna fold wrong sides together, make sure those points match, give it a little crease right there. And then that crease is going to line up with our line, and I am going to still put a pin in there. I don't have to worry necessarily about this piece moving, but I do have to worry about this piece moving. So I'm just going to put a pin right down here. I don't want to put a lot of pins in my freezer paper. Now, here's what we're going to do. The line that we will sew on is right there. So we're going to sew right to the edge of the freezer paper. Now you want to make sure that you don't catch the paper, because if you do, then you've ruined this and it will be, it'll be stuck to it and you have to tear it off. That's what we're trying to avoid here. You don't want to go too far out or your seam allowance is going to be off. So we want to sew right on the edge of that paper slowly, and then we will press toward the newly added piece. Okay, so I have sewn right along the edge. Didn't catch the paper. I did it nice and slow. I'm going to remove my pin, and then I am going to press toward the newly added piece. That's going to stick this piece down to the freezer paper. Now, you want to be careful. Don't get your iron on the glossy side. We try and keep it off of there if we can. A small iron works well. I have one of those little tiny irons. Not the little teeny ones, but about that big. That works well too. But we're just going to make sure that is ironed down, which it is. Look at it, it's nicely fused. Then we are going to proceed just like we do with any other foundation piecing. We're going to fold that back, trim, and add those other 3 triangles. So do that, and then we'll come back and trim and remove the paper. So I have sewn right along these edges. I did not catch my paper in. And now I'm going to press this open. We want to make sure once again that we've got this pulled nice and taut. We don't want to stretch it, but we want to make sure that there's no tucks or folds. So there we have it. We are going to trim the block on our 6.5 inch marking, which is all the way around the edge. And we're just going to go ahead and trim all the way around the edge. Flip our block. And now we're going to remove the paper. So you can see we've got this beautiful, perfect block. And freezer paper does do that, that's for sure. That block is perfect. When we remove the paper, pull it back, and look, it just comes right off. And there we have the block. Now I used the darker fabric so you could see the lint that it picks up. That takes away from the glossiness. I would guess with this particular fabric, I can probably get 3 blocks out of this and that's it. But 3 blocks is better than nothing. I mean, it's better than having to reuse the paper each and every time. So when I do that, then I remove the paper. I can reuse it just like I did before. And again, we've got a really perfect looking block here. So this is not my preferred method necessarily if I'm doing a lot of blocks, but sometimes you have foundation piecing blocks, several different ones within a quilt, or maybe you just would prefer this method and you don't mind doing the prep work when it comes to printing it off. If you have an inkjet printer, I think it's probably a lot easier. But again, you really want to make sure that you back that freezer paper with something else before you send it through your printer. You don't want to ruin your printer, and I think there's a chance of doing that if you're not super careful with it. So that is how you freezer paper foundation piece.